She had no shoes, no coat, just a threadbare dress that hung off her frostbitten shoulders like a shroud and a satchel clutched so tightly beneath her that it seemed even death would have to pry it from her hands. Grace didn't remember how far she'd walked after he tied her there, didn't know how many hours she'd crawled on bleeding feet through snow that swallowed her ankles and numbed her bones. Time had stopped meaning anything. Pain was the only language she had left. The storm had moved on. But its breath lingered in the brittle air. In the way her skin cracked and her lips bled blue. Her arms were curled around her belly. Not from warmth but instinct, as if she could still hold onto something. As if she could keep the life from leaking out through every shiver. Every broken breath. Harlan had promised to take her west for work. Said he'd known a widow's shelter. Someplace she could sew or clean. Maybe even teach. She had believed him. She had wanted to believe. Because what else was left when you buried your husband under collapsing stone and the town priest handed you half his wages and a sack of flour like it was enough to live on? What else could you do when you carried a baby no one wanted to hire? No one wanted to hear crying. No one wanted to see? She'd sat beside him on that wagon, stiff with cold and bruised from the trail, whispering lullabies to her unborn son while Harlan smoked and muttered. When she finally begged for rest, just a moment, just to lie still, he had pulled the wagon off the road and told her to get out. She remembered the way he wrapped the reins, the way he stepped down slow, like he'd done it before, the way he grabbed her by the arm, tied her to a tree with coarse rope, and said, "You're too weak to make it. I'll take the boy. If you die, he lives." Then he left. No backward glance, no hesitation, just the sound of wheels groaning against snow-packed trail. Fading into silence. Grace had screamed until her voice gave out, kicked until her ankles bled. Then she stopped, not from peace, but because hope was a cruel flame, always dancing just out of reach. When the rope slipped, it wasn't triumph, it was delay, a cruel twist of fate that forced her to keep moving. Alone. She didn't know where she was when she finally collapsed. She remembered the sky, how wide and cruel it was, watching her like an eye that didn't blink. She remembered thinking maybe this was how it ended. Maybe women like her weren't meant to survive. Not after being used, not after being discarded. She thought of her child, of his tiny hands, of the blanket she'd sewn from scraps, of the name she had whispered into her belly every night like a prayer. Eli. 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 She whispered it even now, lips cracked and trembling, as the cold settled deeper into her bones. That's when the shadow came. At first, she thought it was death. A towering silhouette against the snow, cast from the shape of a horse and rider. She didn't move, couldn't. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to see him dismount. His figure blurred by pain and half-frozen lashes. He didn't speak, didn't shout or question. He simply knelt. His hands were calloused but gentle as he brushed her hair from her face. The breath that fogged between them was warm, real. When he reached for her hand, something in her, a part long silenced, tried to speak. But all that came was a croak. And then, barely more than wind, a whisper. He took the baby. The man, Chaza, froze. Not in confusion, in understanding. Something in the way she said it, the rawness, the broken finality, told him she hadn't just been hurt. She had been left. And that kind of pain didn't just fade. Without another word, he pulled the heavy buffalo cloak from his saddle and wrapped her inside it. Not because she'd asked, she had no strength for asking, but because he had listened. To her voice, to her silence. He lifted her as if she were weightless, just a bundle of bruises and ribs and grief, and placed her against his chest as he mounted again. She remembered the rhythm of the horse's gait, the way his arms tightened around her every time she stirred. And then darkness. Warmth came next. A fire. The creak of an old roof. The scent of pine and ash. She drifted in and out of sleep. Fever. Fear. Still clutching the satchel like a lifeline. Even unconscious, her fingers refused to let go. Because inside was all she had left of him, the blanket. The Bible. Proof that she was a mother once. Even if the world had tried to erase it. When she finally stirred again. It was night. She saw the man, the stranger, tending fire. Crushing herbs into broth. He had not asked who she was. He had not demanded anything in return. He had simply waited. She gasped again, Throat raw. One word this time. Wagon. He leaned closer. Wheel. She fell back into sleep. But he understood. He never said it, not then, but she felt it, the shift. The moment he became something more than a rescuer. He became a witness, and maybe, if she didn't die, he could become something else, something even rarer in a world that had only ever taken. A protector. A listener. A reason to believe not all men leave. She had lost everything in that snow. But something about the way he carried her, wrapped her, kept her alive, told her she hadn't lost herself. Not yet. And that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over. Chaza didn't ask for permission. He didn't leave with a promise or speak in riddles. When Grace lay shivering by the fire, her voice barely stronger than the wind outside, she asked only one question. Would you go after him? He didn't answer. He simply stepped outside, into the snow. The wind pulled at his cloak. But he paid it no mind. Kneeling beside the hut, he pressed one calloused palm to the frozen ground. Then, with one finger, he drew a circle in the snow, a sacred sign of clarity, of seeing things as they truly are. His people had done it for generations, calling truth to the surface when lies threatened to bury it. That night, he sharpened his knife and reinforced his saddle straps. He didn't sleep, he didn't pray, he listened, and when morning came, he mounted his horse and rode toward the ridgeline. Chaza was no stranger to cold trails or cruel men. Harlan Bishop was both, the kind who stole, not because he needed, but because he believed no one would stop him. He'd taken Grace's child and tied her to a tree like a discarded thing, and rode on, thinking no one would follow. But someone was following now. The trail was faint but readable to someone who knew where to look, shallow wagon tracks. The occasional hoof print, and once, a broken branch too fresh to be the work of wind. Midway through the second day, Chaza found a cloth diaper near a frozen stream. It was stiff, but clean, folded carefully and not abandoned. That meant the child was alive. Not well, maybe, but alive. The knowledge steadied his hand. His breath slowed, but his thoughts grew darker. A man who would abandon a woman in the snow was capable of far worse to an infant. He rode harder now. By dusk the next day, he spotted smoke curling from behind a bluff. As he approached on foot, he found the wagon tipped slightly in a ditch, its wheels half sunk in slush. He crouched in the trees, silent as the wind. Through a gap in the canvas flap, he saw him, Harlan, slumped near a fire inside the wagon. Rifle across his lap, a pan of beans heating slowly. He looked worn, drunk, and dangerous. There was no sign of the child. Then Chaza heard it, a whimper, small, muffled, not from inside the wagon, but behind it. He circled wide. There, half buried in snow and stuffed inside a wooden crate like cargo, was Eli, swaddled in torn furs, cheeks pale, breath shallow, but alive. Chaza moved without hesitation. He lifted the crate gently, cradled it close, and turned back toward the trees. He hadn't gone 10 steps when Eli whimpered again, louder this time. From the wagon came a shout. "That you, girl? I told you." The voice stopped mid-threat. Chaza turned to see Harlan stumble out, rifle raised, eyes red with rage and confusion. He didn't see Chaza, not until the arrow struck the snow inches from his feet. The man froze. Chaza stepped forward, silent, steady, the firelight catching the lines in his face, the sharpness in his stare. "You," Harlan spat. "You one of hers?" Chaza didn't speak. He held Eli tight against his chest, one hand resting near his bowstring, the other near the baby's back. "Go west," Chaza said, his voice low and deadly calm. "You've got until I count to 3. Harlan laughed, bitter, drunken. "You threatening me? 1. This ain't your fight, Redskin. She owed me. 2. Harlan's grin faltered. His eyes flicked to the baby. "He's mine now." Chaza took a single step forward. That was all. The look in his eyes said what words could not. The next arrow would not miss. Harlan's breath caught. Then, with a muttered curse, he lowered the rifle. "She ain't worth it anyway." He turned, stumbled, didn't look back. Chaza didn't either. He wrapped Eli tighter, touched the boy's cheek, warm, real, breathing, then turned east, guiding his horse back through the snow. He didn't ride, he walked, so the child would feel his heartbeat. would hear his voice if he needed to whisper. Because this was not just a rescue. This was a return. Grace had nearly given up watching the horizon. Her body was still weak. Her ribs ached. But something stronger had taken hold inside her, a thread of belief. A thread she hadn't let go of even when Harlan took Eli. Even when the cold threatened to silence her forever. She stood outside with a branch for balance, watching the line where trees met white. Hours passed. And then, a shadow moved. Not a deer, not wind, a man. Chaza, walking through the snow with the baby pressed against his chest like something sacred. Grace's knees gave out before he reached her. She didn't cry, not right away. She simply dropped to the ground like her body no longer needed to hold the pain. When he knelt and placed the bundle into her arms, her fingers trembled so hard she could barely open it. But then she saw him. Eli, red-faced, squinting, one mitten gone. He blinked up at her, as if recognizing something buried deep in his memory. She pressed her lips to his forehead. "Mama's here," she whispered. "Mama's here." Chaza stepped back, giving them space. But Grace looked up through her tears. "Did he?" Chaza shook his head. "He left." She searched his face, the blood on his knuckles, the tension in his shoulders. "You didn't kill him," she said. He said nothing, but she knew. And somehow, it meant more that he hadn't. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She held Eli like the world might take him again. But it didn't. Because someone had followed the trail. Because someone had listened to the whisper in the snow. Because someone had chosen to return what was stolen. And that someone stood guard outside the firelight. A protector. A warrior. A father. Whether by blood or by will. And from that night forward, Eli was no longer missing. He was home. They arrived at Tokala's hollow just as the snow began to soften at the edges. Spring wasn't fully here, not yet. But something in the air had changed. The cold no longer bit, it lingered like memory. Not threat. Grace sat atop the horse. Eli bundled against her chest. His breath warm against her collarbone. Chaza walked beside them, silent as always, but with a new kind of steadiness to his steps. He wasn't just leading them to shelter. He was bringing them home. The hollow was nestled deep beyond the second ridge, past the line of black pines where few dared venture. The land bowed gently inward, as if the earth itself had curved to cradle what lay hidden there. And in the center, rising from moss-covered stones and pine needles, stood a small cabin, weathered, stoic, and waiting. "It's been empty since I was a boy," Chaza said, stopping in front of the door. "But it remembers." Grace didn't ask how a place could remember. She just knew that it did. The moment she stepped through the doorway, something inside her loosened. Not relief exactly, more like belonging. The air wasn't warmer, but it was right. Familiar, though she'd never seen it before. She set Eli down, and the boy, legs still wobbly, crawled across the pine needle-covered floor with a giggle. The sound echoed off the stone walls like the beginning of a hymn. Grace smiled, knelt beside him, and looked up at Chaza. "Why here?" she asked. Chaza turned toward the mountain beyond the cabin. "Because this land belonged to a warrior who died protecting children not his own. His blood's in the soil. That matters." And that was all she needed. In the weeks that followed, they made the hollow livable. Chaza repaired the roof with cedar bark and patched holes in the walls with tightly bound reeds. Grace stitched curtains from rabbit hides and strung them up to soften the light that filtered through the door. They collected firewood, set traps, and hauled buckets of fresh water from the stream nearby. Life slowed, but in the best of ways. Each morning began with the hush of dew and the soft rustle of animals waking in the woods. Eli would be the first to stir, clambering over Grace's legs to reach the warmth of Chaza's chest. The man never said much. But when Eli reached for him, his hands softened, his brow relaxed, and sometimes, only sometimes, he'd hum a tune so quiet it felt like part of the wind. Grace took to walking the edge of the hollow with Eli strapped to her back. Gathering herbs and roots Chaza taught her to identify. He named each one in Lakota, repeating them until she could echo the sounds correctly. "Wichapi," he said, holding up a blue flower. "Wichapi," Grace repeated, laughing when Eli tried to say it too. By mid-afternoon, she'd be kneading dough or drying berries. while Chaza smoked meat near the cabin or carved wooden spoons by the fire. In the evenings, they ate side by side on the floor. Eli nestled between them, his cheeks full and red from sun and laughter. There were no clocks, no bells, no schedules, only rhythm, only peace. One evening, as the last of the sunlight painted the trees gold, Grace stood at the stream washing their clothes. She glanced over her shoulder to see Eli toddling behind Chaza, trying to mimic his every move. The man was fixing a snare trap, and Eli was fumbling with a stick, proudly mimicking. She watched the two of them, this quiet, patient man and her brave, bright son, and felt a kind of joy she'd never known. Not the kind that shouted. The kind that settled deep in your chest and whispered, "Stay." When she returned to the cabin, Chaza handed her a steaming cup of pine tea. "You've changed," he said. Grace blinked, surprised. "Me?" He nodded slowly. "You don't walk like you're bracing anymore." She looked down at her hands. "Maybe I'm just showing up to who I was all along." He smiled, rare and soft. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not a vow, not even a promise, just understanding. The cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was theirs. Chaza carved designs into the frame, birds, deer, and a mother with a child curled close. Grace painted the interior with dyes made from berries and wildflowers. The walls bloomed, even in winter. By summer, Eli was running barefoot through the stream, chasing frogs, his laugh echoing across the hollow. Grace taught him to speak Lakota and English side by side. Chaza taught him to fish, to listen to birds, to sit still and respect silence. Their days weren't without work, there was always something to chop, to mend, to smoke, to gather, but none of it felt heavy. Not like the burdens she used to carry. These tasks weren't survival. They were building. They were choosing. Sometimes Grace would lie awake at night, watching the moonlight dance across the cabin floor. She would listen to Chaza's slow, steady breathing, to the soft sighs of Eli dreaming beside them, and she would whisper to herself, "This is my family, not by law, not by title, but by love, by choice, by quiet, daily acts of care no one else ever gave her." And every morning that she woke to the sound of a fire being stoked or a little boy laughing as he jumped onto Chaza's chest, she thanked the part of herself that hadn't given up, the part that had whispered into the snow, the part that had survived. Because here in Tokala's hollow, she was no longer just a widow or a woman abandoned in a storm. She was Grace, mother, partner, protector, home. The air had changed. It wasn't the season. Spring was still holding its breath along the ridgeline. It was something else, something in the way the wind moved slower, the way birds stopped singing at dusk. Chaza noticed it first. He returned from hunting later than usual, eyes scanning the ridges longer, his bow always within arm's reach. One morning, Grace asked, "Is he coming?" Chaza didn't answer right away. He watched the woods beyond the cabin, where shadows had lingered too long the night before. "I think he already has," he finally said. That night, they extinguished the fire early. Grace wrapped Eli in his rabbit fur sling and lay beside Chaza on opposite sides of the room. Both were awake, both listening. Just past midnight, it came. A single crack, sharp, deliberate, not a branch giving under snow, but a bootstep, a man. Chaza rose silently, an arrow already knocked, eyes fixed on the door. But no one came in. At dawn, he found the prints, one pair of boots, circling the cabin once, watching, waiting. "He wants you afraid," Chaza said simply. Grace stared at the prints, her jaw tight. "Will you stop him?" Chaza's voice was steady. "I already did once, but now he wants you to believe I won't again." Grace didn't cry. She didn't shiver. She stood. That afternoon, she walked into the clearing behind the cabin. The trees watched her, tall and quiet. She lifted her chin to them and began gathering fallen branches and twine. Chaza approached as she bent to tie the pieces together. "What are you building?" he asked. "A fence?" "No," she said, standing. "A marker." She carried the blue cloth from Eli's old blanket, the one he'd been wrapped in when Harlan took him, and tied it to a carved wooden stake. Then she drove the stake into the earth at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the cabin's reach. "A grave?" Chaza asked. "A message," she replied. "He doesn't get to haunt us anymore." He doesn't get to take up space in here. She tapped her chest. He left me to die. He tried to steal my son. But I'm not the one who's buried. Chaza stood silently for a long moment. Then he stepped forward and placed his hunting knife at the base of the stake. The blade gleamed in the light, catching every ray of defiance in its edge. If he comes, Chaza said, he'll see we've already buried him. It wasn't a literal grave. It was something deeper. A boundary. A line in the earth. A declaration that said, this life is claimed. This woman is not alone. This child has 2 parents now, one by birth, one by oath. 2 days passed. Then, while Grace was hanging laundry in the clearing, it happened. A bootstep. Not quiet, not hidden. She turned slowly, and there he was. Harlan Bishop. Filthy, grinning, eyes yellowed from drink, his rifle slung low, like a threat disguised as laziness. There you are, he drawled. Thought I might have buried you too deep in that blizzard. Grace didn't flinch. You left me tied to a tree. She said, you broke your word. You don't get to rewrite the rules just because you came back. He stepped closer. Where's my son? Not yours, she said firmly. Not anymore. Harlan's eyes narrowed. You think he'll remember you? You think he'll care? You were nothing but a widow with a loud mouth and a baby that cried too much. Then came the voice behind him. No, he'll remember who saved him. Chaza stepped from the trees. Bow raised, arrow drawn tight. Every muscle in his body was still, coiled with purpose. The fire in his eyes didn't burn, it scorched. You again, Harlan spat, always hiding behind a woman. Grace stepped forward, standing beside Chaza, her voice unwavering, not hiding, choosing. Harlan raised the rifle, but too slow. An arrow hit the ground at his feet, kicking up dirt and warning. Chaza didn't miss. I won't tell you again, he said. Leave. You have no claim here. No name, no place. Harlan looked at Grace, then at Eli, who stood in the cabin doorway watching, clutching the edge of the door with wide eyes. Then back at Chaza's hand, steady on the bow, and, for the first time, he backed away. No curses, no threats, just silence. The kind of silence that meant he knew he'd already lost. Afterward, Grace walked to the marker in the clearing. She placed her hand on the blue cloth and whispered, it's over. She turned to Chaza. Do you think he'll come again? Chaza's answer was calm. If he does, he'll find an empty place where fear used to live. Grace smiled, but it wasn't relief. It was victory. That night, as the fire crackled low, she sat with Chaza and Eli curled between them. There were no words spoken about the confrontation. No celebration, just the quiet knowing that they had stood their ground. They had not run. They had not begged. They had faced the past and said, you don't own us anymore. Later, as Grace braided her hair by the fire, Chaza watched her with that unreadable stillness of his. You look ready, he said softly. She met his eyes. I am. She no longer carried the weight of who she had been when she arrived in the snow. That woman, frozen, bleeding, voiceless, was gone. In her place stood someone who had faced the storm and didn't flinch. Someone who had stood between danger and her son, and did not tremble. Someone who was not alone anymore. Not a victim, not just a mother, not a woman surviving day by day, but a warrior. And warriors don't run. They never stood before a preacher. No vows were spoken under stained glass. There was no ring, no white dress, no crowd bearing witness. And yet, Grace had never felt more married. Because in Tokala's hollow, marriage wasn't a contract. It wasn't words written by someone else. It was a rhythm, a silent agreement lived out in the way Chaza stoked the fire before she woke. In the way she mended his shirts without being asked. It was in the way Eli ran to them both with the same breathless laughter. Knowing he was safe. It had been over a year since the snowstorm. Since she collapsed, barefoot and frostbitten, in the shadow of a stranger's horse. That woman no longer existed. Now, Grace moved through the world with intention. Her steps were firm, her voice steady, her heart, once held together with fear and silence, now beat with something new, peace. Each day in the hollow began the same, the sunlight warming the eastern windows of their cedar cabin. The low hum of Chaza preparing tea. The rustling of Eli's small feet as he tried to sneak outside before breakfast. Grace would stretch beneath the patchwork quilt they had stitched together and smile before her eyes opened. There was nothing grand about the life they built. But it was theirs. Chaza had carved a necklace from sweet grass and bone. He gave it to her without ceremony. Wrapped in soft deerskin. He didn't ask. Didn't offer a speech. He simply said, "My mother gave this to me. She told me I'd know when to pass it on." Grace had taken it with trembling hands and fastened it around her neck. "Then I accept," she'd whispered. That night, they sat in silence, not needing more. The fire danced. Eli slept between them. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pines. Inside, something permanent had taken root. They were a family now. Not because the law said so, but because their hearts did. Over time, word of them spread, not through letters or proclamations, but through stories. An old Lakota couple arrived first, bringing dried berries and soft pelts. A quiet trapper came next. Someone who had known Chaza as a boy, and left behind a handmade knife. Even a Comanche woman stopped by without a word, placing a carved eagle feather beside their door. They didn't come to judge. They came because they'd heard, not just about the woman who survived a blizzard, but about the life that had risen afterward. Grace never expected community, never expected kindness without condition. But Tokala's hollow was different. It didn't demand history or bloodlines. It welcomed what was chosen. Eli grew like wildflowers after rain, quick and bright and full of questions. He called Chaza Papa without hesitation. Not because someone told him to, but because that's what love called out of him. When he fell, Chaza was the first to catch him. When he asked why the stars moved, Chaza pointed to the sky and named the constellations in Lakota. Grace watched them with quiet awe, her son being raised not with fear or scarcity, but with language, stories, patience. Chaza taught Eli how to listen before speaking. Grace taught him how to speak without apology. Together, they gave him the things she'd once thought impossible, roots and wings. One spring morning, Chaza returned from the ridge with his arms full of wild lilies. "For you," he said, placing them gently on the table. Grace laughed, brushing hair from her cheek. "What's the occasion?" "You said once," he replied, "no one ever gave you flowers." She stared at them, then at him, and felt something rise in her throat. "No one ever stayed long enough to know I liked them," she said softly. He didn't respond, just smiled in that quiet way of his and went back outside to split wood. And that, she realized, was love. Not the loud kind that demanded attention, but the steady kind that remembered the small things. The kind that stayed. They held a ceremony in the way only the forest could witness. No guests, no declarations, just the three of them standing at the edge of the garden. Eli nestled between them, the eagle feather still resting near the cabin door. Chaza pressed his forehead to Grace's and whispered, "In my language, there's no word for wife that means possession. Only the one who shelters beside me." She closed her eyes. "Then that's what I am," she said, "and what you'll always be." Grace no longer thought of Harlan, not in fear, not in regret. The past was buried, not forgotten, but no longer in power. The blue scrap of Eli's old blanket still fluttered on the wooden marker in the clearing. A quiet reminder, we survived you. And we became more than what you tried to break. Now, when she stood outside the cabin with sunlight on her face and Eli's laughter echoing from the stream, she didn't feel haunted. She felt whole. One evening, as stars bloomed across the sky and the pines whispered with wind, Grace stepped outside alone. The hill where the marker stood glowed faintly in the moonlight. She placed a hand on her chest. "This is home," she whispered. Behind her, she heard the cabin door creak. Then came Eli's small voice, sleepy and soft, "Mama?" And Chaza's deeper one, calm and sure, "Come back to bed." She turned to them, her son, her shelter, and felt her smile rise from somewhere deep and everlasting. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living, loved, chosen, free.